This is George Dingledye at Wabash Carnegie Public Library Oral History Program, interviewing Edward Sherman Lower, 14 Ebert Drive, Somerville, New Jersey, on the first day of August 1985 at the home of Della Tillman, 157 West Main Street, Wabash, Indiana. They call you Sherm, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Sherm?
They don't now. They call me Edward.
Okay.
And I didn't know how to respond. I
Yeah.
mean, it's Medicare, it's Edward.
Yeah. Well, how do you want to be referred?
Call me Sherman.
Okay, sure. When I ask you a question or anything like that, just continue talking and we'll figure it out. First of all, tell me about where you were born, when you were born, and who your parents were.
I was born in Williamson, West Virginia, in March the 24th, 1908. And my parents were Edward A. Lower and Lola McClure Lower.
Very good. Were you the only member of the family, or were there brothers and sisters?
No, I had an older sister, and she was 4 years older than I. Then I had a younger brother who was 6 years younger than I. I don't want to confuse it.
Yeah, okay.
And both my brother and sister are deceased.
Okay. When you were a child or early on in life, do you remember either your maternal grandparents or your paternal grandparents?
I remember my paternal grandmother and my maternal grandmother and my paternal great-grandmother.
Okay. Let's start with your paternal great-grandmother. Who was she? And
Emma Newton Crow.
okay.
And she lived in Wabash when I knew her. She lived to be about 93 or 4 years old. She's interred in the Falls Cemetery out here.
Okay.
And then her daughter, my maternal grandmother, lived in Wabash but died in North Manchester, Indiana.
Name?
Her name was Emma Lower.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she had the same first name as your great-grandmother then?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. On your father's side of the family, the paternal side of the family,
Well, that was paternal.
those were the Lowers on
Yes.
the paternal side.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, on your maternal side of the family, you knew your grandmother then?
I knew my grandmother. She lived in Wabash and died here. And I didn't know her mother, but she lived here.
Yeah, okay. Let's go back to your paternal great-grandmother, correct?
Yes.
Mrs. Lower would be Irma
Yeah.
Lower, was that her name?
Yeah. Crow
Crow.
was her married name.
Yeah, okay. What was she like? What did she look like? I think that's the important thing.
When I used to go visit her as a very small boy,
Okay,
she was old then. She died in her 90s.
yes.
And the Newton in her name, was a maiden name. They were related to the Newtons in England.
Mm-hmm.
Not Isaac. Isaac Newton, of course, didn't have any children, but there were Newton families there.
What did she look like? What was physically, what was...
She was a small woman with long hair, wore glasses.
Yeah.
Actually, she looked like some of the characters in Dickens' stories.
Do you
But I don't say that in a derogatory
No.
way, of course.
what do you remember visiting her, or did she live
Yes,
with your grandmother?
I would walk down and visit my paternal grandmother, then go up and visit her mother, my paternal great-grandmother,
Yeah.
and then I would walk up and visit my maternal grandmother.
Mhm.
Her name was Marguerite McClure.
And they all lived here in Wabash?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Where?
I could walk on Sinclair Street and East Sinclair Street,
Yeah.
and then up to Wabash Street, and then back home.
Yeah.
And I lived down on Carroll Street at the time.
Do you remember the addresses or anything at that time, sure?
No,
Yeah. Are the houses still there?
no, this house where my maternal grandmother lived, the paternal grandmother, and I grew up in that house. It was just torn down a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
My granddaughter was with me out here, and she said, I want to see where you live.
Mm-hmm.
So we went by there, and they were just cleaning the lot off.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the oldest houses in Wabash, and it mostly was black walnut with wrought iron nails in it.
Probably done.
Oh,
Isn't that
that's right.
amazing?
Yeah, I wonder what happened to the black walnut.
Well, I'm sure it's gone.
Someone recognized it.
Yeah. Oh, sure. I'm sure. Let's check. Just as a matter of curiosity, do you remember anything that your grandmother or your great grandmother cooked that was unusual, that was good, that you as a little boy going up there to visit him would?
No, the only thing I remember that my paternal grandmother was an excellent cook, and she lived during the Civil War and before, and but not particularly anything that she cooked. But I had eaten a lot of her cooking, and up to the time she died. She then lived in North Manchester.
But she wasn't a specialist in apple pies or.
No, not that I know of.
Yeah. What did your parents do? What did your father do? And
My father was a civil engineer and worked for the city of Wabash and became city engineer. Later he was county surveyor of Wabash County and made the first full maps of the city of Wabash.
Mm-hmm.
They've disappeared. I'd hoped they wouldn't, that they'd go to the Historical Society, but when my mother left the house back in about 1948 or before, I asked that those maps go to the Historical Museum. I've gone in there and they can't find them. And the way I know about them, I knew the maps, but Herman D. Hartman, who lived here, he came in as a young surveyor from New Jersey on the Erie Railroad. I worked for him one time, told me about it. He said, your father made the first full maps from the records of the city of Wabash.
Mm-hmm.
There were two of them. And then he worked for the Big Four as the Big Four Railroad as a civil engineer. Before he was married, he located the MK&T Railroad through the state of Texas. He traveled in a covered wagon and went to the Rio Grande River.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was born in West Virginia because he worked in West Virginia, and my parents moved back to Indiana when I was 3 years old. And he was connected with the United Thackeray coal mines down there. That's in Mingo County, West Virginia, and it's full of coal mines. That's all there is there.
Uh-huh.
And he was chief engineer of those mines. Then he worked on it for various railroads when he wasn't married in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah,
Then he was also, I don't know how, but he was county surveyor in Miami County at Peru.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it was a political job of some kind, but they needed an engineer, and he'd been in the field, so they worked. Then he was city engineer of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma,
Mm-hmm.
but not for long, I don't think.
Yeah.
And then he took out a land grant down in Oklahoma. I have that, the original, in 1901. That's before he was married, and when he was traveling down in there, and for $1, but he didn't homestead it, so the land was taken from the Apache Indians and the various tribes and so forth. I don't know why he took it out.
Yeah. He sounded like an interesting character.
Well, he tried, but he would get terribly homesick.
Yeah.
And he kept diaries in a field book, and those field books in those days were leather-bound books. And he wrote a fine hand, but he would get homesick and talk about wondered why he was out in the West and why he'd left his home and so forth. And he used to get homesick, I was told, when we lived in West Virginia, so homesick that he'd get on the train and come back to Wabash, and then he'd go back, and then he was all right.
Yeah.
But I never got homesick, but my sister did when she was in Indiana University so badly that the superintendent would take her down, put her on the interurban. She'd come up to Wabash, stay all night, get back on the interurban and go back to school.
Mm-hmm.
And she graduated in 1926 down there. She had the highest grade that had ever been given on a state board examination. She didn't tell us, we read it in the paper, but she then admitted it.
Yeah.
She's a good student.
Yeah. Now, your father, how did he meet your mother then? With all this
Well,
traveling?
they
around?
both lived in Wabash.
Yeah.
My
But he-
mother was born in Goshen,
Yeah.
but she grew up in Wabash,
Yeah.
and she lived right across the street here.
Yeah.
One time, family.
Yeah. And her maiden name was
Lola McClure.
McClure. And they met here in Wabash and on one of his trips
They knew
back
each other,
to,
yeah. They were married in Columbus, Ohio, according to the records.
Why?
Well, he met her there, and she went on to West Virginia with him.
Mm-hmm. What are your earliest recollections of your mother and father?
Well, I would say I can think back to about when I was 5 years old or 6 years old, in there.
Mm-hmm.
Just, and my mother graduated in the first class to be graduated in the old Wabash High School in 1894.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated in the last class in 1926.
Right.
Well, don't tear the place down.
Yeah.
It's a nice building.
Beautiful building.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Too bad that it's not in some use or even as a museum now.
Yeah, that's right. But what did your mother look like?
She was a tall, dignified looking woman. She was musical. She played organs and even in the pipe organ.
Mm-hmm.
Always played piano.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it's difficult to describe someone like that.
Yeah.
Thank goodness I have some pictures.
Yeah. Was she a good cook?
Yes,
Yeah.
but she was always in public life and work.
Yeah.
She was secretary of the American Red Cross for 25 years, county.
Uh-huh.
And she handled the job well. She read law. She knew everything. She was on the board of Associated Charities in Wabash.
Mm-hmm.
There were some other members, Mrs. Beitman and Wolf Girl, I think, and Mrs. Dr. Wilson's wife.
Yes.
And they would, I don't know who appointed that board, but they took care of the poor when they had to be taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
It was called the Board of Associated Charities
Oh.
here.
Where did you live then?
We lived
Growing up.
When the first I can remember, we lived on Carroll Street,
Yeah.
near where the Christian Scientists had their church.
Right.
They're not there now. Someone else didn't understand. And then we moved
You live north of there or south of there?
north.
North of there.
Yeah.
Is the house still there?
No, I don't think so. I looked the other day.
Yeah. Okay.
And then the house was torn down. That was my grandmother's house. And we moved there. And she moved over to North Manchester and lived there the remaining part of her life.
Yeah.
She, her husband, my grandfather, was in the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
The war between the states, they call it down south.
Mm-hmm. What was your growing up days like here in Wabash?
Well, I don't regret any part of them. There was no kindergarten in my day. You
Right.
just started to school in the first grade and went right through the ward buildings, the 8th grade, and then to high school, which was only a senior high school.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. Out of senior high school, went to work to get some money to go to college.
Yeah.
And
You went to West Ward School then and graduated?
West Ward, and then when they had to shift some students around, I'd go up to Miami.
Yeah. And you graduated from high school in what year then?
1926.
1926, yeah. And who was running the high school in those days? Who was the principal?
Darnell was the principal.
Uh-huh.
I don't remember his first name.
Yeah. And who were your teachers back in those days?
In high school,
Yes.
Ruth Jones and Miss Blaney, Leo Carpenter, Philip Magner, Rex Sims, Bess Bear. She taught mechanical drawing. In history, one teacher was Catherine Troxel, and Stella Moore, who was the assistant principal.
Mm-hmm.
Good teachers all the way through. Never regret ever having gone to any one of them.
When you graduated, what did you do? You graduated in 1926?
26, I went to work for Honeywell.
Honeywell.
Worked as an assembler and then an inspector.
Yeah.
And after I accumulated enough money to go to school start, I went up to Tri-State College or Tri-State University
In what
at
year?
Angola in 1927.
Okay.
And I'd have to go out and work to get some more money to go back and so forth. And I matriculated in electrical engineering and didn't pursue it any further. I switched to civil engineering, and I almost completed a degree in civil, but I thought, well, that is not the field I want, so I went to chemical engineering, in which I graduated, which then was the most difficult discipline of the time, but I enjoyed it and had a good background. And I graduated in 1931
From Tri-State.
from Tri-State.
Okay.
Then after that, the Depression was in good shape and going great guns. You just didn't get a job anyplace, but I made up my mind I would get a job, and I did. There was an opening back at the college, and I went up there and taught for 1 year. And then no job again. And I had to go outside of Philadelphia to get a job, which was a little difficult in those days. You had an old Ford, no turnpikes or anything.
Yeah.
Went out there and worked for almost 2 years as a chemist. Oh, I worked at various other things as I was out of school. And then I left there, came back, and taught 2 more years at Tri-State. Then left that because an opening came up at Alexandria, Indiana with Johns Manville. And so I was interviewed and got the job, position, and I went to the president of the college and said, I've got a job, and the man I was replacing was over in the University of Notre Dame. He couldn't make up his mind when he was coming back. He was working on his master's and doctorate, and it was so uncertain, and so he said, well, go ahead, we'll cover some way. And I went to Alexandria, Indiana with what was the old Banner Rock, then Johns Manville, and the rest of my working time until 1973, when I officially retired, was with Johns Manville.
Oh,
After a transfer in 1948, well, actually there were 2 plants. We started a plant in Richmond, Indiana in 1938. The war was coming on. Everyone knew it. We were making insulation for aircraft, and then during the war for ships. And so one staff operated both plants. And we had a telephone line, we worked, that's all there was to it. And then after the war, I was totally at Alexandria and took a transfer into Manville, New Jersey, where I worked the rest of the time.
That's why your address now is New Jersey.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I lived different places out there.
Yeah. Going back to your mother, I think it's fairly well known that she was also the truant officer at one time.
That's right, she was for
Yeah.
a period of time.
Yeah. You remember those days?
Oh, yes, very well.
Yeah. And what were her responsibilities? And
Well, to maintain records and to check and see why students weren't in attendance every day all over the city.
Yeah.
And she did. She did a good job.
Yeah.
To the point where one time, my wife and I took her to Indianapolis. She wanted to see a woman named Blanche Mary, who was the head of the whole state. And she told her that she had the highest success grade or something in the work in the state of Indiana, which I wouldn't question the way she operated.
Yeah.
If she didn't know, she knew who to ask.
Yeah.
And she could work the whole county.
Who was the superintendent she was working under in those days?
O.J. Neighbors.
Mr. Neighbors,
He came from Maryland. He's now retired.
Yeah, he's dead
I
now.
know him well.
Yeah.
And I often think about him. He was a fine man. He had his office as superintendent of city schools, and he would visit the 5 ward buildings, see what was going on. He'd drive his car. He'd always have some paper and pencils in the back, which he would give to the principal of the building. Now you look, and here's a truck that the school board hires. So the fellow's wearing out the truck. He's working on his pension. You're paying him his salary. You have to pay insurance on it. And he's just hauling some pencils and paper around.
That's right.
No, I don't mean to be mean.
Yeah, very true. It's
I,
true.
I don't know. I never had to work that way,
Yeah.
and I was never permitted to work that way.
Yeah.
And it's just a tremendous burden on the taxpayers, and
Yeah.
doesn't contribute anything to the success of the educational system.
What was your father doing all these years when?
Well, he became paralyzed, totally paralyzed, and he died on my 12th birthday.
Mhm.
So he didn't do anything.
He had a. What was the cause of the paralysis?
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just paralysis. Some people have strokes, and that's it.
That left your mother then with 3 children?
She reared we 3 children,
Yeah.
kept the house together, and that's it. And she was secretary of the Red Cross and on the board of Associated Charities. She actually, I can remember, prepared the school budget each year for the city of Wabash.
Oh.
There was a secretary there, but my mother prepared it.
Uh-huh.
And every year she knew what to put together so they could take it before the board, and you have your school city here and you have your civil city,
Right.
which you don't have in the east. You have the politicians are in on the schools out
Oh.
there, but where I live, and I couldn't get used to it. In Pennsylvania, they work like we do here,
Yes.
and
She must have been a pretty strong-willed person then.
she lived about 50 years ahead of her time.
Yeah.
One of those people.
She never had any thoughts of remarrying or anything like
No,
that? That never.
She wouldn't have had time. She was a religious woman, and she was a Presbyterian. She played the piano at the Presbyterian church. I've heard her play the pipe organ in another place, but Bernice Hipskin was the organist at the Presbyterian church here.
Mhm. Who incidentally just died, you know.
Beg pardon?
Bernice just died.
Oh, did she?
Well, within the last year.
I,
She was 92 or
she
97.
would
or-
have been, yeah.
Yeah.
They lived up on Ferry Street. I was their
Right.
paper boy.
Yeah, she just died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was young, I was their paper boy, and she taught music there. I think my sister took violin lessons from her.
And her daughter played the harp, of course.
Yes, I remember. She was and Bernice was a harpist.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Did you haul the plain dealer back in those days, or the Time
I was
Star?
a carrier.
For the Time Star, or the plain dealer, or
No,
whichever
there was
one?
2.
Yeah.
There was the plain dealer, and I think the Star was the morning paper.
Right.
And then later they were combined.
Right.
But I had a route and rode a bicycle or walked on foot,
Mhm.
and I made $1.50 a week,
Mm-hmm.
and peddled the paper 6 days a week,
Mm-hmm.
rain or shine, snow or anything else.
Yeah. Good
That was
money.
it. It was good money.
Good money. Back to Tri-State. When you went to Tri-State, was General Hershey? Was he a classes ahead of you, or
Much ahead.
much ahead of you?
And when I was at Tri-State teaching there, he retired from the United States Army
Mm-hmm.
at 45. It's in the
Yes.
newspaper up there.
Yes.
And he had set up the selective service system as a military man in case we ever went to another war. But he was fully retired at 45.
Yeah.
I know the history of the man. He was a fraternity brother of mine.
Yes.
And I've heard it all. I met his brother and all that stuff. But anyhow, he was in the National Guard. He had an earned degree in teaching pedagogy out of Tri-State College. He was from out at Orland. That was his home.
Mm-hmm.
And he graduated from Tri-State College, was in the Guard. The Mexican border trouble came up.
Before
He
World
was-
War One, yes.
He was down there. Then he was in World War One, and then he had an earned PhD in, I don't know what field it was in, but then Dykstra, they said they would never appoint a military man as head, I don't know if you remember this or not, of the draft
Mhm.
system.
Right.
And so Dykstra, from I think Wisconsin or something, was appointed. He was a civilian.
Mm-hmm.
And after about a year, he got enough of it and he resigned. So who did they put in? They put Louis B. Hershey in, and as head of it,
Yeah.
because he knew the workings of all of it.
Yeah. Had you met Hershey?
No, I've always missed him.
Yeah, never met the man.
And
Yeah.
he came back, they say, every month to Angola,
Right.
no matter where he was.
Right.
And he didn't worry about selective service. It was there. And people would write in trying to evade military service or get favors, and he would send the letter immediately back to the draft board where the guy lived. This is where he didn't bother with it.
Yeah.
And then he ultimately became a five-star general. Nixon made him that.
Right.
But I guess he was a pretty nice fellow. Everyone knew him.
On another subject, and we're going to be jumping around.
Go ahead.
You talked about losing a leg. How did that happen?
I'm a diabetic.
Yes.
It runs in the family,
Yeah.
and it is now they believe it to be hereditary. My mother was diabetic. Her mother was diabetic. I can remember that. And the female back of them was a diabetic, so it comes right down. So I'm a diabetic. My brother was a diabetic. My sister was not a diabetic. She died of 3 types of cancer.
Yeah.
She lived in Ohio.
Yeah.
She might have gotten it. Now, she had 2 boys who were grown when she died, and I found them. And one lives at Avon Lake in Cleveland, near Cleveland, and he was in the Korean War, and he's diabetic.
Oh, really? It's
And
all
he-
through the male line?
He had a brother who was, he says, in industrial work. He was a salesman, paint salesman and so on. But he went on and completed his college education and is a teacher at Oral Roberts University, an assistant professor of marketing at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And he has 3 boys. Jim, his brother in Cleveland, my nephew there, 2 sons. One is classical musician, just graduating from Baldwin Wallace College. That's where they grew up.
Right.
And the other one is graduated from some college in Ohio. He's a graduate. He's in political action work in the state of Ohio. But they're nice boys. I've met them. And
Well, when did this diabetes catch up with you then?
I was about 55 years old. So
Your business career was not over then? Your engineering
no,
career?
that made a difference.
Yeah.
And I understand it. I've been a chemist for 65 years
Yeah.
as being a chemical
Right.
engineer
Right.
and being in a family and so forth. And I do what the doctor says. I try to go to someone that knows something about it and will exercise some care. And so I make out, or I wouldn't be talking to you here. And I hope we see you again.
Yeah, well, I
someday.
hope so. Was this a big shock?
No,
No,
because
not
I
really.
expected it might happen to me.
No.
You don't do anything to hasten it, and you can't do anything much to slow it up.
Have you noticed, I'm sure you must have noticed, that the treatment of diabetics between your grandmother and your mother and your era is certainly considerably different.
But they still don't know too much about diabetes.
Right.
And I read it in the Chemical Engineering News. I belong to the American Chemical Society and have for years, and that gives me an opportunity to keep up on what's going on in the world and everything.
Insulin was...
Discovered in 1922 or 3 by Banning and Best in Canada. And I was in high school. I just started.
Did your mother use insulin?
Not then.
Yes.
And
But she did in later
controlled
years?
the diet.
Yeah.
And when she did start to use insulin, she came to our house. My wife was a registered nurse. My sister was a registered nurse. My daughter is a registered nurse.
Yeah.
So we got them in the family.
Yeah.
And we started her on insulin, got a doctor down there, and she always gave it to herself.
Yeah.
She took insulin until she died, except that she lived with my sister in Ohio,
Right.
and she took care of her. She took care of her.
How old did she live to? Roughly.
About 82.
Oh, that's great with diabetes.
But she took care of herself.
Yeah. And Grandma, how long did she live?
Her mother, I don't know how old she was.
Yeah.
I may go out and look that up in the cemetery.
Yeah.
I couldn't get in this cemetery a couple of years ago because the weeds were so high. I couldn't find any of the stones.
Yeah. That's at Falls?
Yep,
Gee,
they're in
don't
the
say-
old part.
Yeah.
I
Don't
went up
say
to
it.
the museum, and they have a book I found. They showed it to me. Everyone's buried out there.
Correct.
Who they were, how long they
Right.
lived when they were born.
Right.
I thought it was a pretty nice thing.
Right.
But I'll still go out and look. I know where now I see the grass is cut out there.
That's
So they
right.
must have changed hands.
We have a new sexton.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
And I've got a peg leg,
Yeah.
and I don't get around too well, so I can't tramp around.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go out there before I go back. I think I'll go out either Saturday or
Yeah.
I probably won't tomorrow.
Great.
I want to go up to the museum.
You should go out while the sexton is there, because he has the records and everything.
Well, you can drive in. There's
Yeah,
no
sure.
gates.
Yeah, no problem at all.
You know why they have a wall around the cemetery, don't you? I didn't mean to
no.
interrupt you.
Who did you go to high school with? Who were your high school friends?
There's some around here.
Yeah, who are they?
Well, Merle Gamble.
Merle Gamble?
I don't know if Dick Gillen's still alive or not.
Yes, he's in the nursing home.
Oh, he is?
Yes.
I've been going to call him, but I called up Eddie Gribben's house.
Right, he's dead.
Eddie is a year older than I.
Right. He's gone.
And a woman answered, and I said, is Eddie there? And she said, oh, he died 2 years ago.
Right.
So that's why you hesitate to ask around
Yeah.
town what goes on.
You almost have to identify yourself and then
Yeah.
tell them.
So,
Yeah, Dick's in the nursing home.
yeah, I knew him when we were in
Yeah.
high school. Some of them moved away, never came back.
Who else was around here?
I went to high school with.
Yes. What year did you graduate?
In my class, I
Yes.
graduated in 26.
Was Bill Gray in your class then?
No, he was behind me.
He was behind you. How about Bob Smith and those guys?
Bob Smith's lawyer.
No, he was the janitor at the Christian church at the end. I don't know what he did all
I was janitor at Christian Church, too, for 3 years.
Yeah.
With Eddie Gribben, we were co-janitors
Yeah.
in high
But
school.
Bob lives on Hill Street, and
No, I don't know him.
you had to stop and see him because I'm sure that he'd be around the same. Tony Corso, he'd have been younger than you.
I remember the name.
Yeah, he would have been younger than you, much younger than you.
But there were girls in the class, too, like I find out Helen Sigmund, Della knew her.
Yes,
She's in Florida.
yes.
And she was in our class. Oh, I don't know. Difficult to remember.
Yeah, it is.
But pops up. Harold Wolf was ahead of me. I
Harold,
saw him
yeah.
a couple of years ago. Now he's gone.
He's gone, right.
He remembered me.
Yeah.
And Armand Baylor was in high school, but back of me, he had a brother in my class. I don't know where he
They're
is.
both around.
But
still.
I was-
Yeah. Armin's still around, yeah.
I know Armand is because I've seen him
Yeah.
a couple of years.
Right.
And the one in my class was Walter. Is Walter there? Here?
I think Della, is Walter still living?
Walter Baylor?
Baylor?
Walter Baylor? Well,
We'll have to ask Armin.
yeah. I haven't seen him this trip. I don't know if I get to see him or not. He's a nice fellow.
Yeah. What are your memories of Wabash? You know, it's a great town.
It is. It's
It
still
is
a
a
great
great
town. I've
town,
boosted
yeah.
to high heaven.
Hey, it's a great place to live.
Yeah, it is.
It really. What are your memories of Wabash?
I have no complaints at all about the way I was treated in Wabash.
You enjoyed
Any
the-
respect, huh?
You enjoyed the school. And,
Yeah, certainly did.
When you were kids, did you? Was there any particular store or any place that you went to?
No, not in those days. We would,
When you get your money from the paper route, did you?
well, usually stop in Gackenheimer's old drugstore there and get a Sunday.
Right.
And it was along the north wall there, and Mr. Gackenheimer was usually in the back.
Right.
He came from Germany. He was a neighbor of ours. He learned his pharmaceutical work there.
Mhm.
That's back in the days when they ground up everything and made their own medicine.
He learned his pharmacy in Germany.
Oh, sure, he came
Yeah.
from Germany.
Right.
And they all went to the German church up in the East End. I knew a lot of those people. And most of them, the older people, that came here before World War I to
Mhm.
escape military training
Mm-hmm.
under the Bismarck.
Uh-huh.
And they were stonemasons and so on. And they built these courthouses. They would leave town and go work on these courthouses. And this granddaughter was with me, and we'd go through Plymouth, Indiana, Warsaw. And I said, now look at that courthouse. You can see who built it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was these Germans. And I said, they never learned to speak English. Now, my mother studied German in high school. And then World War I, they wiped it out. I suppose they put it back now. They changed all the names of the streets up there. And she never forgot her German. She never was in a German-speaking household, but she knew German grammar. She knew enough words. She could go up there in the East End and talk to these people, converse with them, knew enough. And the boys that I grew up with here, they read, wrote, and spoke High German, we called it, the best in their household. And all of them were schooled in it at home. And Armin Baylor told me, we were talking about people coming in from foreign countries and expect the people who are here to speak their language. He said, when I went to the first grade of school, he said, I couldn't speak a word of English. I had to learn English. And of course, he talks like you and I do now. And some of them got out of high school here and went to Purdue University and took engineering. And the requirement was you had to take a foreign language. So they'd immediately sign up for German. And they talked just like someone who lived here all their life. And they didn't have to study the German. They could put their time on, apply their time to other subjects, and they would tutor fellows that couldn't get German and get paid for tutoring them. And no one was ever the wiser.
Yeah.
Oh, this is actual fact.
Well, how did you meet your wife?
Well, my wife was a staff nurse at the county hospital here.
And what was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Jeanette Jenkins.
Okay.
And
who were her parents?
Beg pardon?
Who were her parents?
Amy Halderman Jenkins and John Jenkins. And they lived in North Manchester, of course. She had brothers and sisters and all that, but she went to Manchester College and quit after a year and went in nurses training at Elkhart General Hospital, from which she graduated. And she's the third best nurse that ever lived, or the second best nurse that ever lived. Now my daughter's the third, and I don't want to lose her. They're good. I mean, they're excellent nurses. I'm sorry, they had better training than they get today as a nurse.
Is your wife still living?
No, she died 7 years ago.
7 years ago. From?
Multiple complications. She had cancer, blood cancer, and bad lungs, and they always thought she'd been shot by a machine gun, looked like it. But nurses frequently were that way. They'd been exposed to tuberculosis and never knew it. They'd have lots of scar tissue and so on. But she was a good nurse. Then we had the 2 children who live in the East, and so that's home to me now. I have to have half the year it is, and I go to Florida the other half. I'm a coward. I don't like the ice and snow anymore. I've seen it all. And but getting back to the Germans here in this town, I had asked Armin Baylor, I said, what happened to the German church up here? The German Evangelical Church is up on Huntington Street, I think.
Huntington and Walnut.
They used to preach every Sunday in German. So if you didn't understand German, you didn't get the sermon. And he said, and then I said, I remember they started and they would preach 1 Sunday a month in English, 3 Sundays in German, and then 2 and 2, and then until I guess it became all English. He said, that's right. He said, oh, we sold that church and we built a new church out on North Wabash. You passed it when you came into my house. I went in there to see him.
Yes.
And I said, well, I remember that because the Gackenheimers, and Paul's still here, and all his brothers and sisters.
Robert's still here.
And I ran into Dave in a drugstore.
David, yes.
I said, are you a Gackenheimer? He said, yes, I am. And he said, I think it was David, he said.
Yes.
And I said, well, I knew the whole family. And they used to sit in the porch swing and speak nothing but German. It was easier that way. And good family.
They were your neighbors?
Right straight across the street from where we lived, And Paul was my brother's age. He was younger than I. Then when he got through high school, he went down to Indianapolis and studied pharmacy, and so did some of the other kids. And I imagine they're good pharmacists.
Yeah, they are. Good,
well, they
good
should be.
Yeah.
Their background.
Do you remember the Ku Klux Klan in Wabash?
Yeah, but it wasn't like the one down south.
Yeah.
After the
Well,
war
how
between
old were you in 1926?
How old was I in 26? 18 years
18
old.
years old.
Sure,
And
I remember it.
what do you remember? Did they ask you to join, and did you join and all
No,
that?
I never joined the Klan.
Yeah.
But everyone else, half the people did in town, half the ministers in town were for it, half were against it, and they fought perpetually in the congregations. Half the congregation was for it and half against it, and the feelings ran high. But it was just a ploy to collect money, organizing this Klan. I don't know, maybe you were a Klansman.
No, I'm too young for that.
And
I hardly could be with Catholic in my background. I could hardly be a Klansman.
well, I'm told by a Mason in town here, I belong to Hannah Lodge up here.
Yes.
I was raised in
Still,
Hannah
yeah,
Lodge.
okay.
And I said, there was a couple of students at Angola, and they came down to the fraternity house. They were mechanical engineering students from New York State. And I remember one's name was Freddie Bavenzio. And they wanted to join the Masons. Well, they couldn't join in the fraternity, but they told them how to go about it, petition a lodge uptown. Well, they did, and they did become Masons there, and they put some fraternity brothers on the investigating committee because they were students, and I wasn't on it. And I said, what would happen, now what will happen when you go back home? What's the priest going to say? And they said, we don't care. But now, and they seem to kick this thing around, in some countries, Roman Catholics are Masons.
Yes.
In Italy and Ireland and so forth. I know that, I've been told. And these fraternity brothers of mine were all Masons, as was Louis B. Hershey.
Yeah.
He helped found that fraternity.
Yeah.
So they were from everywhere, even South America, these Masons.
What was do you remember the Klan as being active at all in Wabash? Or?
They had meetings.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Parades,
I saw no activity. I can't remember anything. They put, I don't know whether they bought robes or put white bed sheets over.
Yeah.
And we'd try to guess who was under their sheet according to the size of it.
Yeah.
And joke about it.
Yeah. How about the Depression?
Well,
Tell me about the Depression and how you survived.
I was ready.
Everything hit bottom here, what, about 33 or 32?
Oh, I don't know when it hit bottom.
Yeah.
But we were in a depression, and the banks were failing here, and I had saved some money and put it in a bank. My mother said, I think you better get it out. I had $150 to start college.
Yeah.
Things aren't the same today as they were then. So I get the $150 out and I go to college. And I went as long as I could with that, which was about 2 terms into the winter.
Right.
And then when I was paid by the college, the depression was still on, and they would collect the tuition, and they banked out of town, I don't know why, and they would pay your salary for 3 months when they paid. Then you had to figure out what you're going to do with that, how you're going to live on it.
Yes.
And I put mine in postal savings. I was married then, and I thought it'd be pretty safe there, and it was. We had a lot of fun in the Depression. These young people today won't believe what happened in the Depression.
Yeah.
If you tell them, it just doesn't register because they weren't there. But my wife made, at this county hospital, $150 a month. And they laundered all her uniforms. There was no such thing as nylon. It hadn't been discovered or made then. So they were all cotton uniforms. And they had to take care of their personal laundry. And they had all their meals and had a place to live, the nurses. And one woman ran the whole hospital, Ada B. Strayer, with an iron hand. She was just a nurse. And if the doctors misbehaved or anything, she'd just tell them to get their instruments and get out and don't come back until you can behave. They never dared abuse a nurse. Today, in present years, I've seen doctors abuse nurses verbally. And if I'd have been a nurse, I'd either thrown something at them or walked out. But nurses never had any difficulty in getting a job back in those days. They were always employed, knowing that they didn't do anything bad, and they could just walk in and get a job. And so she made a lot of money. There was no taxes on and until she got married, then she quit and we moved away. But she did a lot of things on her own, as did my sister and any of these people, these old nurses. I won't call them old nurses, those are trained. And they knew, they were smart, and they, during the war, why, we had a couple of children. I was working 7 days and 7 nights at the plant and on call all the time. And she would go out and help take care. There was only a doctor or two in the whole community, and help take care of people and act on doctor's orders. And then she'd come back and say, they don't have anything. I didn't charge them anything. And I said, that's all right. We've got enough we can eat, so why worry? And she did a lot of work like that, and just a good, solid nurse.
What do you remember about the Depression personally, though? I mean, or
Well,
did it even affect you? Were you ever out of a job? Or?
Me? Oh, sure, I was out of a job, and I couldn't get a job, and you couldn't buy a job. And I'd get, borrow an 04 or something, I'd go all over northern Indiana, and I'd go to the back of plants where there might be a chemist or something, and I'd get in touch with someone, talk, tell them I was looking for a job, and usually it'd say, well, they don't, you can't hire anyone, and I don't even know how long I'll be here. So at one time, I went outside of Philadelphia to get a job. That's how far I had to go, but I made up my mind I was going to get a job. There was always jobs. There's jobs today. I don't know what's wrong with people, if you want to work.
Yeah.
And so I was looking for a job. When I got out of school once, was out, didn't have any more money, I came back and someone said they want servicemen down Honeywell's. Well, I knew all the controls, so I went to work and worked on that. And then I didn't stay there long. I went out and got a job as a chemist out at the asbestos works, which is now occupied by Ford Meter Box Company. I knew all the Ford family. I passed papers to the mom and pop. And Mr. Ford always had time to say, come on in. And he'd have the Scientific American and say, see what is in here. And then he'd sit down and discuss it. And they were kindly people, and they were kindly to their employees. I don't know whether you remember them or not.
No, that would be the older folks.
The older. And then they had the 4 sons, and they all were engineers, all went to Purdue.
Right.
Now they have families. And when their children were born, my wife was a staff nurse out at the hospital. There was just 2 nurses at night took care of that whole hospital. And I'll bet you haven't got a lot more beds out there today than they had then.
Probably
and people,
not.
some people died. Most people got well and got out of there. They operated on them. Now you built a whole new hospital and tore down the old hospital, tore down a perfectly good nursing home. We got too many chiefs, not enough Indians in this outfit.
Very true.
That's just what had happened.
Very true. Did you, what was downtown Wabash like when you were a kid?
What do you mean, like?
Well, I mean, what were the stores, Beitman's?
Beitman Wolf. It looks today, the buildings and all, a lot like when I was young and here. And many of the houses, and I remember people who lived in them, and Dell and I have toured the city, and she said, how do you remember that? I said, well, you remember who lived here and there. And no, it was a good, substantial business district. There were no outlying shops like you see.
Right. Renner's shoe store.
Beg pardon?
Renner's shoe store and the Boston store.
Oh yeah, Bachman shoe store.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Stephanatis came here after World War I.
Right.
Had the shoe shop. My mother always worked with him a lot.
Yes.
She'd go to Jimmy and she'd say, someone doesn't have any shoes, some family. She knew everyone in town, they knew her. And he'd say, all right, I'll repair their shoes for him. He didn't charge anything. He worked all the time. And he was very proud that he had been in the American Army. He was very proud that he had a brother who was a Greek soldier, and he was always showing a picture of the Greek soldier. We have a Greek cook in the kitchen out in New Jersey, and he came over as a young man. And he was in the Army. And nice fellow. He's a good fellow.
Where do you live now? Do you live in a sort of a retirement home, or?
Me?
Yes.
No, I live with my daughter.
Yes.
After my wife died, we had a home fully improved and everything, and lived there from 1962 till 1978. And I wouldn't live there. I wouldn't maintain a home. And I just told the children that after the funeral, I said, look, forget it. I said, I will not maintain a home. And she said, oh yeah, the daughter said, you have to come live with us. And I said, we're kidders. I said, oh no, that never works out. I wouldn't come live. You have to. The children are looking, they were all grown. They're looking for you to come live with us. So, you out of gas?
Nope.
So I went to live with them, and fortunately, and they lived then in North Plainfield.
Uh-huh.
And it wasn't but a couple of months, I had two infected toes. And I was going to a doctor in Springfield, who a board-certified internist, treats diabetics. And she said, well, you better call the doctor and tell him what this looks like. One toe was black. She says, how long has this been going on, my daughter? I said, oh, just a few hours, 48 hours or less. And I said, you call him. I'm an engineer, you're a nurse, and you can explain it. And so she did, explained it to him, and he said, meet me at St. Barnabas Medical Center. That's a big medical center up there at 6:30 in the morning. And that's so away we went. I had another call. It'll be 7:15. He was standing in the emergency. He must have told her to be prepared to admit him.
Yes.
And it was gangrene in one toe and the other one infected. That was my good leg. And so they shot me in the hospital. And then they said, well, what we'll have to do is cut the toes out, the two toes, and leave a V there, and hope the V will heal. You know, diabetic and all that stuff. So they went through it, and it started to heal pretty well. And we'd go up to the surgeon who did the work and check it out, and she took me in her van up there. She had a VW van. I had a walker, and I could go. And one Friday afternoon, he was digging the second visit, he was taking the proud flesh out there. The daughter was standing there, and I was watching him, and they seemed to have to pick a lot. In some way, he set up an infection.
Yes.
And within 2 hours, I had so much pain, I could have laid my head down on a railroad track. And it just continued from Friday night on through Saturday. So I called and got a hold of him up there in North Jersey and told him what was going on. He said, well, do you have anything to take for it? I said, yeah, I have some codeine you gave me. But he said, well, take that. So this thing goes on from Friday night through Saturday, Sunday, and into Tuesday. And my daughter took me back up to this basic doctor who didn't do any surgery. And he took a look at it. By that time, the entire foot was infected. And he did the old, you can delete this when someone dies. He did the old doctor trick. He goes to another room, so we can't hear him. He called this surgeon way up there, came back. He said, go up and see Dr. Seltzer. He'll see you right away.
Yes.
He would have no more to do with it. So we go to see the guy. I never got home because the big medical center was in between that place and home. And my daughter dropped me off there, and they tried everything to reduce this infection, and they couldn't. And you don't shop around, you know what's going on. And they decided they had to amputate, and they said if we schedule it, it'll be a couple of weeks, emergency now. So within an hour or two, I was in surgery, and they amputated below the knee. Yeah. And then the other leg and foot, got lots of things wrong. I've lost a great toe, and had a big hole in my foot, diabetic ulcer. I have a lot of fun. I've got a couple kinds of heart trouble and silicoasbestosis. So
You're in pretty good shape still, though.
yeah, I figured I might as well battle it out with the help of anyone and the man above.
Yes.
And so after they amputated this, they got in touch with Kessler Institute of Rehabilitation up in West Orange, which is known all over the world. And they made some arrangement that I'd go and be examined there to see whether they would admit me. They only have about 7,800 beds and maybe a couple thousand outpatients in the place. And so we went over there. I still don't know how we got over there. And they checked it out. And then they said, there's no room. And then after lunch, they fed us lunch. They said, well, there'll be a room today. So I went in there and I walked out of the place in 11 weeks.
Great.
And I had the stitches in the leg and everything. And that was it. I did just what they said for once. And that's the best way to get along.
You behaved, huh?
Oh, yeah. You mean the statute of limitations run out?
Yes.
You mean the older boys
Yeah.
put the wagon there?
Yeah. What happened?
Tell
Well,
about the wagon. No one knows how.
it seems as though that during Halloween there was always a lot of activity, of extracurricular activities. We came to high school one morning and the big pilasters out in front there. From the pilaster to the wall there was a gravel wagon, like they hauled gravel in on the country. And yet no one could move it because it was just wedged in there.
Uh-huh.
So apparently these older fellas went out in the country, got the wagon, pulled it into town, dismantled it, put it behind that, then put it together, put it on the porch there.
Yeah.
And Della's still looking for the fellows that did that.
Yes. Who were they?
What?
Who were they?
Who wouldn't?
Who were they?
Oh, I have no idea. Some of the fellows in high school.
Well, have you any idea why the lights went out, Sherman?
Sure.
Yeah.
Where your shopping center is, out on the Chippewa Pike on Cass Street,
Yes.
there was an aviation hangar built by the Service Motor Truck Company.
Right.
That's all there was there.
Correct.
And Johnny Showalter and I were friends. He was a year older than I. We're downtown like we frequently were, and then we started home. And on the way out, Johnny said, the Klan has a big meeting out in the aviation hangar. And Uncle Homer's there, and he knew who was there, and I suppose there's probably a bunch of ministers, power people, telephone people. The place was full, I guess. And he says, what can we do to devil them? Decided that we would pull the power. We knew enough about it. So we picked up a piece of rope, clothesline, walked out the pike. He crawled up the pole, we put a hook. There was fuses, brown ceramic fuses up there. There's a 33,000 volt line up there, and it dropped down to 2,300 and so, and furnished all the power along the pike there. And we got down over the little wire fence, pulled the plug out, so everything was in total darkness. And we watched them scurry around. They came out, started their cars, flashlights started, but someone figured out what was wrong. And it didn't take them long to get. By that time, we had cut through the cemetery and were sitting back in the cemetery watching them.
Yeah.
There was nothing there but a field.
Yes.
Johnny lived up the far pike, and I lived back in town. So after it all quieted down, he went home and I went home, and I think they're still looking for the guys who put them in darkness. Army Street.
Butch Howard had his place right there
Yeah,
across from...
I bought suits of him. He sold them. They were made in Cleveland.
Right.
I forget the name of them offhand.
But he had suits, and he'd measure you.
And they were good. The price was all right, and the suits would fit, and no problem.
Yeah. Butch Howard was okay, nice guy. He was a bugler, for the Klan. He
For
was
the
just
Klan? No,
oh, yeah, yeah.
There were so many people mixed
Yeah,
up
oh,
in
so
it.
they're all mixed up in it. Yeah,
She lived with a Dawes family,
yes.
and the Dawes family had a son named Lynn Dawes. He later became minister of the French church.
Right.
They were Quakers,
Right.
First Rite Quakers on. And I don't think he belonged to the Klan. I think he was opposed to it. I don't know. He later then went to some church in Detroit. I didn't know him. I knew of him all the time, and Mother knew him. Of course, he went to school to her. A lot of these people went to school to her. And they would stop and say, are you Lola McClure's son? And I'd say, yep. Well, she taught me in some place in a school and so forth.
Yeah.
I never forgot her.